Hello everybody, my name is London Drysdale. I'm a designer and builder and owner and operator here at Cherokee Valley Railroad, where we build and sell custom 1/87 HO scale items such as vehicles, craftsman buildings, and dioramas. And starting now, I'm going to be making a series of videos on how to build these amazing scale dioramas, just like the lighthouse diorama you see in this photo, so stay tuned throughout the year as I'll be making more of these videos. So sit back, relax, and I'll show you how to make this very cool lighthouse diorama right now. So every good diorama starts with a nice base or frame, if you will. So in this case, I'm using 1x boards. I'm going to measure out the desired length. I'm going to mark it off with a pencil. Then I'll take a straight edge like the metal ruler you see here and mark my line to make it straight so I know I'll get a good straight cut. So once you get all the boards cut to your desired length, lay them all out and we'll move on to the next step. The next process here we're going to do is conjoin our 4 boards that we just cut together. So I'm going to move them to the edge of my workbench. I'm going to grab a big clamp. I'm going to clamp them down on the edge. Once that is done, we can now screw the boards together. In this case, after I have my boards clamped down, I'm going to take a drill with a small bit and pre-drill my holes. I will now put screws to conjoin my 2 boards together in the 2 pre-drilled holes that we made. Once we have all 4 boards screwed together, we now have a nice sturdy built frame. And now we can start on our diorama platform. In this case, I'm going to be using some pink foam, which is 1/2-inch insulation foam I got from my local Home Depot. I will now take our frame that we built and place it on the pink insulation foam. I will now take a Sharpie and trace the inside of the frame we built onto the foam so we can get a nice even cut. Once that process is complete, we can now take our frame off the pink insulation foam and start cutting. Now you're going to need a nice metal straight edge. In this case, I'm using a level I have laying around the shop. Once you have your level or straight edge lined up on the pink foam where we marked it off, we can now cut the lines. In this case, I'm using an extendable utility knife. Make sure you have a sharp blade for this process as it helps a lot. You may have to make a few cut lines as we're trying to get this as precise as possible. Once the foam is cut, we can remove the excess and move on to the next cut line. Once the foam is cut out, we can now place it into the frame that we have previously built. We will line it up on the corners and then begin to push the foam down into the frame, making sure we have a nice flush surface. Later on, I decided I wanted the diorama to be pushed to the bottom of the wood frame rather than on top, as I thought it would be a lot cooler with the water effect, as well as easier when we pour the liquid resin or our water. Once we get the foam pushed down to the bottom of the frame, we can now start sealing the edges of our diorama. In this case, I'm going to be using some wood glue. I will take the wood glue and make a bead along each seam against the foam and the wood boards for our frame. The wood glue works perfectly to securely hold our diorama into the wood frame that we have built, as well as sealing it up for when we pour our liquid water resin. Once we have sealed the whole diorama, we can now start building up our landform. which is going to be our rock cliff in this case. In this case, I'm using some white foam that I had laying around. I'm going to put 4 chunks on top of each other, building up the landform. To securely hold the foam down to the pink foam, we are going to be using some wood glue. We will put the glue on our pink foam base, and then we will lay our foam chunks that we are going to use for our mountain or hillside, and press them down so that they're nice and secure. We now just repeat the same step, gluing our foam together as high as our desired length. Once we have our foam glued together, we can now weigh it down as it helps the process of the drying. In this case, I'm just using a drill and the wood glue bottle I had laying around, but you can use anything. While the base is drying, we can now start on making our rocks for the side of our cliff. In this case, I'm using Woodland Scenics products and that Plaster of Paris to make our rocks. Rock making is pretty simple and straightforward. What you're going to need is a nice brush and some dish soap. You're going to sprinkle just a little bit of dish soap in each rock mold. Then you will take a cup of water, dip your brush in the water, and start rubbing it on your rock molds, mixing dish soap with the water. This process is so that the rocks release from the molds very easily. Depending on what brand of Plaster of Paris you have bought, the instructions are on the back of the box. In this case, we used that brand, so it was pretty straightforward, just a mix of plaster and water, usually 2-to-1 ratio. Then you can just pour the plaster into the molds themselves. Make sure the molds are on a level surface, and you can also use your finger to pop any bubbles that you see in the plaster. In this case, I used a little drill bit container to level out my rock mold as it had a slope to it. While the rock molds are drying, we can now start cutting our landform. In this case, I'm using the foam cutter from the Hot Wire Foam Factory, which is basically a metal wire that'll burn the foam in your desired cut. I highly recommend getting this tool as it is very useful for cutting landforms and a lot cleaner cuts you can get with this than if, say, you were using a utility knife. Basically, how it works is there's a metal wire between both metal arms that gets very hot and will cut the foam. After we cut a piece, we just move it off to the side and keep the process going until we get the desired landform that we want. Once we have our foam sculpted as to the landform we're going after, we can now grab our building and place it on the diorama. In this case, I'm using the amazing building. It's a craftsman kit from Branch Line Hobbies. It's called Point Lighthouse. There will be a link in the description if you would like to purchase this kit. Once you have the kit placed in the desired location, you can now take a Sharpie or pen and mark out where it's sat, so we know where our scenery can go and not interfere with the building itself. I also make a small dot where the lights cords will run down the diorama. Now we will start making our landform itself. In this case, I'm using a product called Sculpt Mold by Amico. Sculpt Mold is very sought after by scale modelers as it is easy to use and the results are very nice. Now it is time that we mix the Sculpt Mold together with water. In this case, Sculpt Mold takes a 2-to-1 ratio, being 2 parts Sculpt Mold to 1 part water. We will take our mixing cup and make a small line with a permanent marker inside the cup so we know what level we want the Sculpt Mold to be at, so we get a nice mix ratio. So we'll just use our hand here and scoop it into our cup to get to the desired height. You will then repeat the process a second time so we have the correct amount of Sculpt Mold that we need for our diorama. Now that we have our Sculpt Mold in a mixing container, We will now mix the correct amount of water in with the Sculpt Mold. As I said, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, being 2 parts Sculpt Mold to 1 part water. And get something to mix together with, a paint stick or anything that can is nice and sturdy that can mix the Sculpt Mold and the water together. The Sculpt Mold, when mixed perfectly, should have the consistency of almost like a curded milk or cottage cheese, if you will. Once we have the Sculpt Mold mixed together, we can now start placing it on our diorama. So we'll grab a scoop and we'll slap it onto the hillside here. Once the diorama is on our hillside or cliffside, basically all you have to do is just smooth it around with your hands or our smoothing or sculpting tool. Making sure you get it smooth enough on top so we can still have enough smooth. Make sure the Sculpt Mold is smooth on top of our landform so that the building has a nice smooth surface to set on. Continue the process by placing the Sculpt Mold on the diorama until we get the desired landform. Making sure to continuously be smoothing it out as it dries so we get a nice smooth texture. Because as the Sculpt Mold dries, it will get easier to smooth out with your fingers. While the Sculpt Mold is still wet, we'll take a paper towel and clean the bottom of our diorama base, where the water will be, as we don't want any particles down there. Once we have the base cleaned, our rock should be dried up and ready to pull from the molds. To pull the rock from the rock molds, all you have to do is just grab a mold, take the corner of the mold and just separate it, go along the side and separate it out from the mold. It'll come out very easily as we use the dish soap method at the beginning of the process. As you can see here, the rocks look very detailed. If you do break the rocks like I did here, we're going to be using it for chunks anyway, so we will be breaking it anyways later in the video. Now we can head back over to the diorama, and while the Sculpt Mold is still wet, we will take a rock mold and we will break it into our desired width and length. Now that our rock molds are our correct length and height for our model, we will go ahead and place our rock molds into the Sculpt Mold. Basically, the Sculpt Mold here will act as the glue for the rocks. Once you get a rock mold in place, what you'll do is you'll take your finger or sculpting tool and mold the Sculpt Mold alongside the rock, making the rock seams looks like it molds into the Sculpt Mold, like the Sculpt Mold is another form of a rock. Now all I'll do is just continue placing rocks until I get the desired cliffside. And make sure you sculpt the Sculpt Mold into the rock formations, making it look like the Sculpt Mold and the rock molds are of one. That just gives your diorama a more realistic look. Once our rocks are on the model, I'm going to go ahead and place some more rock molds that I made up on the bottom of the base of the diorama, as I want this to represent basically like big boulders in the water itself to give it a really neat effect. Basically what I'll do here is just use some wood glue to fasten the rocks to the bottom of the base. Once the rocks are securely fastened and glued down, we can put our first layer of paint on our rocks. In this case here, I'm just using some acrylic paint. Basically all it is some gray paint mixed with some water and a very small hint of black mixed in there with it. I will then pour it into a mixing container as you see here, and get a brush out, mix the paint with a brush a little bit, and then just brush it right on the side of our rocks. What I'll do is I'll start on the top and let the watered down paint roll down the rock cliff, helping it get in all the cracks and crevices. I will also then use the same paint on the boulders that we have out in the water. Now that that is complete, we can start painting our landform itself. In this case, I'm using a mix of two different paints, a dark tan and a dark brown. We will then use a mixing container as you see here, take both of our paints and pour about half and half each into a section of our mixing container. Once the paints are now in our mixing container, we can just take our brush and stir the paints together, making sure that we have a nice even paint mixture. Once the paint is mixed together, we can now start painting the top of our landform. Basically, I'm just using a normal craft brush here, and this is just 50-50 paint, tan and dark brown mixed together. And we're just brushing the top of our landform right up to the rocks, trying to get as little on the rocks as we can, as we want a nice edge between the top of the landform, which is going to be our dirt, and the rocks. Once that is done, we can go ahead and paint which is going to be our water. In this case here, I'm just using an English navy color from Apple Barrel. It's just an acrylic mixed with another darker navy blue acrylic paint that I had laying around. We will also pull our mixing container back out, mix the same ratio, 50 and 50, together and stir it with a brush. Once our paint is mixed, we can now start brushing it onto the bottom of our base, which is going to be our water. Just brush it on in a fashion where we can not hit any of the rocks, as we don't want to get blue on the rocks. If we do get a little bit, it's fine, because we're going to be going back over them anyway with our paint. Once we have painted the water, we can now move on to the next process, which is going to be our ground form. What we're going to do is take our lighthouse model, put it back on the top of the landform. We're going to make sure it's placed in our desired location. Now I'll zoom down to the ground layer. Now what we're going to do to apply our glue to the scenery is just use some Elmer's white glue. Basically get our paint mixing container, just pour some white glue in one of the container pods. Then what we'll do is we'll just get a brush out and brush on the white glue around the lighthouse where we're going to put our grass. In this case is actually going to be the static grass process. So I'll show you the applicator here in just a second after we get the glue glued down around our lighthouse. What we want to do here is just put 100% Elmer's white glue on. Make sure it's a pretty thick coat as well, as it's going to need to be pretty dense for our static grass. Once we get the glue in the desired location, we will now lift our lighthouse model off of the diorama and start using our static grass applicator. In this case here is a homemade grass applicator that I have used. You can check out other YouTube videos on how to build one of these. They are very cool and very useful products for modelers. I highly recommend checking those videos out. And basically what we'll do here to use our static grass applicator is we have 2 bags of static grass which you can purchase online. I can put a link in the description for different static grass options. In this case, we'll just grab our applicator. We'll grab some grass out of our bag and sprinkle it into the applicator. Make sure when you're sprinkling it into the applicator that you pull some of it apart with your fingers, as it is static grass and it will want to bind together in the container. I'm using 2 different colors of static grass here, a lightish green color and a burnt grass color. I believe these 2 colors go really well together. It gives it a variety of grass color. Once the grass is in the applicator, we can now start the process of spreading our grass on the diorama. Basically here the process works as we have a metal rod connected with a wire into our grass applicator. We'll touch the metal rod against the ground formation and then shake our static grass applicator until we get the desired amount of grass to come out onto the landform. Once you applied the static grass, you want to grab a vacuum cleaner, and here I have a stocking or a pantyhose. Basically what we're going to do is slide it over our vacuum cleaner hose, and then we'll turn on the vacuum and go around where we spread the static grass, collecting all of the loose grass so we can reuse it in the future for other projects. Make sure you vacuum all around the diorama and even on your workbench, as when you spread static grass it does make quite a far ways. And here's the end result of the static grass, in my opinion, which looks amazing every time. It just brings a whole 3D aspect to a diorama rather than just using flat materials. And I always do on every diorama. It's a very cool process and I highly recommend it. To further adhere the static grass to the diorama, I'm going to spray it with a 2-part mix I use. First of all, I go over the whole thing with rubbing alcohol in an old spray bottle that I have laying around. Then what I'll do is I'll grab my glue mix, which is 50% Elmer's glue, white glue, and 50% water, and I'll mist it over the entire diorama, both the alcohol and the glue and water mix, and let it dry until hardened, and it'll be all set for you. Now what we'll do is we'll work on our dirt road. This here is just a mix of dirt from outside, finely sifted in the sifter, mixed with a little bit of sand, and then also we have just a little cup of dried grass, dried leaves that I put in a blender and ground up. It's just great for a surface. Now we will take our finely sifted dirt texture from outside and use it as our dirt road coming into the lighthouse. Basically what I'm doing here is using a spray paint can lid, putting our fine sifted dirt in it, and then what I'll do is I'll grab the stocking that we use to clean up our static grass, pull it over the spray paint can lid, and then just shake it a lot over top of it as it lets out an even amount of dirt throughout the diorama. Once the road is complete, we can now move on to the tree process. Basically what we have here is just a mix of trees from Woodland Scenics, and I believe the far left is a bush tree. Basically what we'll do is we'll head on over to the diorama. We'll take a tree here. We'll pour some Elmer's white glue on the bottom. This is 100% Elmer's glue. And then once we have the glue on the bottom, we'll just stick it into the Sculpt Mold that we have put on the diorama. and it should stay in place pretty well. At least until the glue dries so it's securely fastened down. I will then just repeat the process until we have the desired amount of trees on the diorama. After our trees are down, we will then sprinkle our dried grass and dried leaf blended mixture just over top of the static grass. It gives it the appearance that there's fallen trees, fallen branches, leaves fallen from the trees, pine needles, etc. It just gives it that another form of 3D look that looks really cool at the end. We will then fasten it all down with our alcohol spray, followed by our white glue and water spray. Once all the scenery is securely fastened, we can now finish our rocks. So basically here for our rock process, I'm going to be using a gray acrylic paint, and then I have a black acrylic paint that's about 50% black and 50% water mixed. So it's a really watered down wet mixture. Basically what I'll do is I'll just take a spray paint hand lid here as a mixing cup. We'll shake up the paints thoroughly. And since I was almost out of paint, I decided not to use the mixing cup and just pour my gray paint into the water mix, or vice versa. Now what I'll do is I'll just put the lid back on the paint bottle, and then I will thoroughly shake it. Make sure you shake it for at least a minute because we want this paint to be very well mixed. Once the paint is thoroughly mixed together, we can now pour it into our lid or your mixing container. As you can see here, it's a very watered down paint mixture as we want it to soak into all the cracks in the rocks. Basically what we'll do is we'll just take a powder brush here or a normal paintbrush, and we'll just basically do the same process we did for the gray paint. We'll just start on the top and let the paint work its way down. Make sure to get in all the cracks and crevices, as this is going to be our main paint layer. Once the rocks have been painted, we can now start the whitewash process. So basically what we're going to do here is just take an old rag and take a bottle of white acrylic paint. Now just make sure you thoroughly shake the paint bottle to make sure it's mixed perfectly. Now what we're going to do is, in this case I just use the paint bottle lid as my container, so I can just dip my brush right in the lid and dry brush it onto the rocks. What you want to do here is get quite a bit of white paint on your brush, and then just brush off a majority of it onto our rag, because we're doing a whitewash process, so we don't want much paint on our brush. Once that is done, as you can see here, I'm just brushing an upwards motion, sometimes side to side, depending on the cracks formation of the rocks. We'll just continue doing this over the whole rock face, and the results are very good at the end. Here is a close-up angle so you can get a better view on the whitewash rock process. Once we have whitewashed the cliff, we can now do the same whitewash process on our boulders in the water. As you can see here, I'm just going in an up to down motion, whitewashing all across the boulders to get the same results that we've seen on the cliff. Once all the rocks are completed, we can now seal the bottom piece of foam for when our resin hits the foam, as the resin gets very hot when it's mixed. So basically what we're going to do here to seal it is just put 3 coats of straight up Elmer's glue brushed on the bottom of our surface. What you'll want to do is brush each coat on very thick, as we want this to be sealed very well so we have no issue when pouring our liquid resin. You want to make sure to get every crack and crevice around the boulders and the edge of the diorama, as we don't want the resin seeping through anywhere. Now that we have let all 3 coats of our glue dry, we can now start our resin process. So in this case, for this build, I am using the Envirotex Lite system. It's basically just a pour-on resin, a 1:1 2-part ratio. It's great, fantastic resin. It's one of my favorites I've used so far. What you will want to do is have all your mixing containers present. So in this case here, I have my resin mix container, 2 of them actually, with a line on the one so I can get the correct ratio. What you want to do is thoroughly roll and shake these resins, as we want to get these very well mixed. You'll want to do it for at least a couple minutes of shaking each bottle. Basically we'll take our second cup here and put our mark on it, and so we know how much resin to pour in each cup. So we'll take part 1 of our resin, pour it into the cup until it hits our desired line. Once our resin is poured into our cup, we can now pour the resin that is in our cup into container number 2. This is basically my other mixing cup I had on the table. Make sure you get all the resin out of our cup 1, as we want to collect all the resins so we have a nice even mix. Basically for part 2, we just do the exact same thing. We repeat the same process for part 2 of the resin. We pour it into our cup, into the desired line. Once we have that, we pour it into the second mixing container. And do the same process. Make sure you have all the resin out of your cup, as we want an even mix. Now comes the stirring process. This is going to be a long one, so make sure you have a nice stick here. In this case, I have a nice mixing dowel rod I use. Basically what you want to do is mix it thoroughly for a couple minutes. Once it's mixed for 2 minutes, you'll pour it into another mixing container and do the same process for another minute. Once the resin is thoroughly stirred together, we can head back over to the diorama and make sure that it is very level. As you can see here, I had to shim up with the right side of it, as it wasn't perfectly level. So now we'll take our resin that we have mixed and start pouring it onto our diorama base. Pour in a very slow motion, working your way across your whole diorama, as we want the water to settle in all the cracks and crevices so we get a nice even coverage. Once the resin has dried for 48 hours, we can start our layering process of our water. So basically what I'm going to do now is take some white Elmer's glue, put it into our spray paint can lid or your mixing container. We will then take our brush with the white glue in the container, get a lot of it on our brush, as we want to do a thick coat. And basically what we're going to do is just put a very thick coat all across our water resin we poured, as this is going to give it a ripple effect. And just a side note, make sure you have a white glue that dries clear and not a white glue that stays white when it's dry, as we want it to see through the ripples and right into the water. Once you get all the glue on the diorama, make sure you go back through all the glue with a brush and basically dab it where it makes an even more ripple effect if you wish. So once our glue is clear and we have our ripple effect, we're going to do waves. So basically for our wave process today, for this build I'm going to do one of two wave processes, and this is going to entail just a bead of Elmer's glue thoroughly throughout the diorama from the bottom, working our way up to the rock cliffs. And making sure when you go around the rocks you have it part way, so go up to the rock. Once you get to the rock, skip it, and then go to the other side of the rock. So now that we have the beads of glue down, we're going to make the waves, basically give the waves a trail. So to do that process, I'm going to take a brush here, a small acrylic paint brush, and just dab the beads of glue, basically leaving a little bit of the bead in front and dragging the glue back. So basically just starting at the front of the glue and pulling it back. It just gives it the really cool rippled wave effect. Once I did that, I didn't see as there was enough waves, so what I did is just repeated the same process over again and just did the beads of glue between the beads of glue we've already done. So while the waves are drying, I see now is a good time to paint the frame of our diorama. So my favorite paint color to use as a diorama frame is just flat black. So here I had a few bottles of flat black acrylic paint laying around, so that's what I used. You could use normal house paint if you'd like to. It makes the same process and it has the same result. So basically what I do here is just paint the top surface and the side surface of the frame, trying to not get any paint on the inside of the diorama. So once I paint the frame, I also go ahead and paint the back of the foam on the diorama. If you wanted here, you could actually cover the back of the foam with a small, like 1/8" plywood or even a thick poster board. But in this case, since it's going to be behind something, I just went ahead and painted it black right on the surface of the foam. I did the same process here with both edges of the foam, working my way from back to the front of the rock cliff, just making sure I didn't get any paint on the rocks as we worked pretty hard on those. So here is the result of our painted frame and diorama. Like I said, black is my favorite color as it just is a really standout color. So after we paint this, what we're going to do is head on over to Photoshop actually, because we want to make up a sign for our lighthouse. So basically here I'm in Photoshop, and all I'm going to do is just make up a sign, which I already have here. All I did was go to a font website, find a nice rustic font I liked. I just downloaded it onto my computer and put it onto a barnwood photo I found on the internet. Then what I did is I just grabbed some photos of the Rocky Point Lighthouse kit, put a small gradient over them to fade out the color, put them on the sign, layered them on top of each other, and we were good to go. You can go in depth on this process if you want a sign to look really good. Photoshop to me is the easiest and best way to do so. So after I made the sign up, I went over to my printer and went ahead and printed them off. As you can see here, I also found some really cool little caution steep slope signs I found on the internet, so I just went ahead and scaled them down and then printed them off with the Rocky Point Lighthouse signs. So what I did here is just cut out the signs with a pair of scissors, being careful that you don't cut the signs themselves. Cut out each sign individually and lay it aside. As you see here, the power of the internet makes it a little bit easier. Once we have our signs cut out, we can now start making sign posts for them. So all I did here is just had some little scale lumber chunks laying around. I went ahead and cut them to the same length, and all I'm doing is just using some super glue. I'm taking a pair of tweezers here, and all I'm going to do is just put a little dab of super glue on each board. I'll lay the board down, pick up the sign with the tweezers, and then lay the sign on top of the super glue, while making sure the sign is even on the post. I can adjust it a little bit as the super glue takes just a second to dry. I can now grab the other sign post and go ahead and put a little bit of glue on it, pick up the other side of the sign and stick it on to the post, while at the same time making sure each post is even. Once the Rocky Point Lighthouse sign is done, I can now continue with the same procedure for the caution steep slope signs, by just putting a little bit of glue on each post and then picking up each sign with a tweezer and sticking it on the sign post. While I was at it, I thought it'd be cool to add a few small fences on the road by the lighthouse. Basically, they're just plastic, I believe AHM fences that I just dry brushed with white paint to make them look a little bit weathered. All I'm going to do is just put some Elmer's white glue on the fences and push them down into the diorama until they dry, enough where they can stand on their own. Once I glued down the fences, I went ahead and put some white glue on the bottom of the Rocky Point Lighthouse sign and put it in place where I wanted the sign to sit. As you can see, it didn't really want to stand up on its own, so what I did is just laid the super glue container behind it until it dried. So when that's done, basically what I did is I just went around and placed all the caution steep slope signs around the top of the rock cliff in order. What I did is I faced the signs towards the lighthouse and towards the dirt road, as that's where people would be walking and being able to see the signs. So once the signs are glued down, I thought it'd be a cool time to add some people. So what I did is I just went around my shop and found some really cool figures that were in the sitting position, and I glued them on the rock cliff as they were crawled down there and watching the waves. If you'd like, you can purchase figures like these on eBay or any other websites. Preiser is a good company for them, as well as Woodland Scenics. I also found another figure in my shop I wanted to place up by the sign, as if he were yelling at his kids to come back up the cliff as they crawled down there. So no diorama is complete without a nice little scale vehicle. So I went ahead and placed my Mitsubishi Pajero, my little 4x4 SUV, right on the diorama as if it was parked in the parking lot. And with that, that concludes today's video. I want to thank everyone for staying and watching, as this was a very fun build. If you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up and please subscribe to the channel, as there are more of these videos to come. Also, leave a comment below with any questions, as I like to see your input. Also, leave a comment below with any build ideas you have, and I'll see if I can make it happen. Once again, thank you, and I'll see you guys next time. I'm out of here.